My talk this morning is going to be a little confronting and provocative. I'm going to take off from where Mr. Ranjan Marasinghe left off. He made the point that our work in biodiversity conservation and research must be founded in philosophical underpinnings that make sense in our social context. I think that's very relevant. And by complete coincidence, I'm going to talk on something related to that roundup. If we think about it, all the actions we take in biodiversity conservation are related to values that we have, values that we get from our parents, our school, our friends, our religions, our ethnic background, and so on. And these values are not always the same between people, between countries, and between regions. I think this is nowhere more evident than when you think about the value systems that derive from the religious backgrounds of the East and the West. The founding principle, the first precept of Buddhism, Panatipata Vedamani Sikkhapatam Samadhi, the reverence for life. Pranagate Lalati. That is what we hold most dear in the Buddhist worldview. In the Judeo-Christian worldview of the West, it is different. There, God says everything that lives and moves will be for the use of man. In other words, the Judeo-Christian system places man at the apex of nature. Nature is for the use of man. Whereas in the Buddhist and Hindu worldviews of the East, humans are just another element in the natural world. They have no special place. And these things become very evident when we think about the principle of sustainable use. Sustainable use, which is embedded in the Biodiversity Convention and in many of our policies locally, I think comes largely from the Judeo-Christian tradition of the West. When you confront Sri Lankans at policy meetings with this idea of sustainable use, you often see some head scratching. People aren't really convinced about this. Because somehow, the idea of using nature rather than living with nature is alien to the value system of our country. But this is just one example of the things that divide us when it comes to thinking about values. So do we really believe in sustainable use? In conversations with many people in Sri Lanka, I find that there is no real commitment to this idea. And I can understand why that comes to me. Today, in the course of today and tomorrow, you'll be served short eats, you'll be served lunch. And there's one thing I can be sure about. You will not be served beef. Why is that? It's because there is a value that is embedded in our society now that somehow we don't eat cattle. Many people eat fish because fish are the next thing up from vegetables. But being a fish researcher myself, I've got used to the idea that fish are very clever animals. You can train them to do most things that a dog can do. Fish feel pain, they feel distress, they feel anxiety. They just can't show it because they have no voice and they have no facial expressions. If they had those things, you'll soon appreciate what beautiful creatures, what complex creatures fish are. Here's a little pufferfish. It's a male and it's building its nest to attract a female. Its nest is much bigger than itself. It can't see the whole of its nest. But like an architect, it works out how this nest should be built, and it builds this wonderfully symmetrical nest on the seafloor, something that was discovered only about 10 years ago, in order to attract a female to come and mate with it. Can a cow do this? Can a cow do this? I don't think so. About 60 years ago, at the early stage of scuba diving in Sri Lanka, Mr. Rodney Johnson, my good friend, made this underwater film on the Great Grasses in the south of Sri Lanka. And there he dives in a place where these giant groupers become his friends. These groupers have never seen humans before, but there he is petting this fish, teaching it to play tricks underwater. And it is evident from this and so many other studies that have been done that fish are remarkably sentient, intelligent animals. Yet, we treat them very differently from cows and goats and sheep and chickens. Should fish be subject to a lower moral standard? Some of you will think yes, some of you will think no. I'm just saying this only to illustrate the point that ideas differ. Many people who've grown tired of this argument say, I'm not going to eat meats and fish at all, I'm going to be a vegan. But that is hardly an escape. Because most grain in the world today is harvested mechanically by combined harvesters like this. And this one is harvesting paddy in Rajarata. And with the process of harvesting, it harvests not just the paddy, but the insects, the snakes, the birds, the lizards, the mice that live in the paddy. That is all mixed up in your food that you think is vegan. In fact, this is so well accepted that the Food and Drug Administration in the United States has standards for how much matter from animals you can have in your food. We would estimate that about 20 million mice get mixed up in the rice harvest in Sri Lanka. And these standards by the FDA, as you can see, they're quite generous. In 1 kilo of palm piti, you can have 1,500 insect fragments and up to 20 rat hairs. Is any of this food really vegan? Pasta, raisins, tomato paste, chocolate, cornmeal, the list goes on to hundreds. And each of these is allowed to have a substantial amount of animal matter. What sense does it make to be a vegan in this environment? Taken together with all the other pressures we have on sustainability, like increasing population, declining land resources, including demand for resources by people who want more energy, more food, better quality produce, is there such a thing as sustainable agriculture? I mentioned those mice that get mixed up in your rice. There's no such thing as vegetarian fried rice. I like mice because we use them in laboratories quite a lot, and we have got to know them. And mice and rats are amongst the cleverest animals on the planet, though we treat them as pests. Mice can feel many of the emotions that humans feel. Empathy for the predicament of other mice, high intelligence. They have complex memories. They can distinguish between various forms of memory. They play games with each other, even with their masters in the laboratory. They have sympathy for their other mice that have problems. They undergo depression and anxiety when they foresee a problem coming. They feel sorry for the wrong things that they have done, and they show, just like a dog does, some kind of remorse, and they have joy. They celebrate when things go right, when they get extra food, for example. A cow doesn't do any of those things, but we venerate the cow. And we have to face this in wildlife conservation as well. For example, in Sri Lanka, all Lepidoptera are strictly protected. But moths are Lepidoptera, and many moths are treated as pests by agriculture. We have pesticides especially designed to kill moths that harm especially vegetable agriculture. The macaque is endemic to Sri Lanka, but not protected because it is a pest. The giant squirrel is not endemic to Sri Lanka, but protected because it is mentioned somewhere that it's a national animal. How do we balance out the competing interests of such animals? Are crop pests to be treated as biodiversity too? Should they be subjected to the same moral standard? Those are decisions that we have to make. I want to give you an example, not about our national flower, but about the national flower of Australia. How countries protect such things. Acacia pycnantha is the national tree of Australia, beautiful wattle tree. It's represented also in the Australian emblem. But then molecular phylogenetic studies showed that the genus Acacia, the name, correctly belonged to an African species. Species you see here, which you find also in Sri Lanka as an introduced plant. So the name Acacia now belonged to an African group of trees, and Australia would have to use another name for its own acacias, for its national plant. The Australians were not happy about this. So they appealed to the International Botanical Congress to say, can you please change the rules so that we can hold on to the name Acacia? A big debate ensued. Africa was largely excluded from that debate because the debate ensued in a journal called Taxon, and the subscription annually for Taxon is $928. $928 is higher than the per capita income of 20 African countries. Africans can't afford to buy this journal. Finally, the matter was put to the International Botanical Congress that took place in Australia in 2011. And there they voted to change the rules of botanical nomenclature, to set aside the code of botanical nomenclature and award the name Acacia to Australia. The Africans would just have to find another name for their trees. How representative was this Congress of Australia? Sorry, of Africa. Here's the Congress sitting. There's only one African face to make this decision that affected an African genus of plants. In the third row, there is my Ethiopian friend, Professor Sebseb Demisiou, who I think Cyril also knows. He's been to the New Botanic Gardens. And that's how that decision was made, to protect this name for Australia. I mentioned this, I have close connections to Australia as well, not to speak against the Australians, but to say how much countries and peoples fight for things like names. I'm going to come back to that subject in a minute. But here was a body of scientists, the botanists, sitting and making a moral judgment about the award of a name to Australia or to Africa. Should the fact that most of those scientists were white have made a difference? Does the fact that we in Sri Lanka are brown affect the way we think? I think it does, and it should. Another moral quandary. Should we extract animals from the wild for traditional purposes like para-arrows? This is a divisive topic. I know that many people hold strong views. But if it is wrong to do so, why is it right to keep fish in an aquarium? What is the moral difference between an elephant being kept captive and a fish being kept in a fish tank? Where do you draw that distinction, especially given the background of fish, as I explained them to you a few minutes ago? So by what moral standard can wild animals be put to traditional and recreational use? Mr. Marasinghe referred to poaching and meat taken from the wild. This is something that upsets many people who can't see its relevance. There is, on the one hand, a demand for protein from poor people in rural areas. On the other hand, there is the imperative that we protect wildlife. And how should poachers be treated? Most people, I think, in this room will say that we should have harsh penalties for poaching, and that it is wrong to kill wild animals for meat. But yet, every day we kill billions of fish for the same purpose. Fish are wild animals too. And almost nobody sees something wrong with that. What is the moral difference between a wild-caught fish and a wild-caught salmon? Is there a moral difference? The whole fundamental ethic of civilization, what changes, what makes us differ from primitive human beings 20,000 years ago is the fact that we no longer hunt, we no longer gather from the wild. Instead of that, we farm our food requirements. But yet, the amount of fish that is farmed in the world is trivially small compared to the amount of fish that is hunted in the wild. Should there be a difference, a moral difference between fish that is farmed versus fish that is caught in the wild? We don't make that difference. Sri Lanka is well known for its ornamental fishes. We were one of the first countries in the world, together with Brazil, that began the aquarium fish hobby about a century ago. There are many Sri Lankan species of fish which are bred all over the world and part of this massive global industry. But yet in Sri Lanka, farmers are not allowed to breed these fish and export them. Our law doesn't permit it. But we talk so much about sustainable use, about maximizing the utility of our biodiversity resources. We celebrate the richness of our biodiversity. But still, in many cases, people are locked out. Why do we lock them out? We lock them out because we don't want the wild resources to be overexploited and diminished. And that's right. But at the same time, if people can farm these species and make a living from them, bring foreign exchange to the country, what would be so wrong about that? Some of you might say, yeah, that's a good idea. But if you do that, you have to face the next problem. What if people want to farm jungle fowl and export them for meat? Then you might say, I'm not so happy about that. So these moral and ethical questions come up all the time. If you're sitting in a chair with one of the senior staff from the Ministry, the Department of Wildlife, these are moral problems that I have all the time. Mr. Marasinghe was telling me about a moral problem or ethical problem he was having just recently. I'm not going to talk about it, but you're faced with these problems. The law doesn't really give you a clear solution. You have to find it for yourself. And in discussions with each other, we have to find solutions for such problems. We all agree that invasive plants should be removed from protected areas, and many volunteers help the DWC to do this. That's a fantastic thing, removing Ulex, for example, from Hawthorne Plains. But at the same time, we protect another invasive species in the Hawthorne Plains itself, the trout. When I ask people about this, their argument is that trout has been there for 140 years. Any damage it was going to do has already been done. Is that really a solution? Hasn't Ulex been there for 140 years as well? And what is worse, there are many diseases now in the world, novel diseases that go around infecting fish and spread from fish to other aquatic organisms like aquatic invertebrates and to frogs. Having fish there is possibly a real risk, but it somehow feels terrible to start killing fish in a protected area. Not so bad when we kill the plants that are invasive. So why is it that alien plants, but not alien animals, should be eradicated from protected areas? Another problem occurs in the case of the samba, in the same national park. Here, 60 years ago, potatoes and vegetables were cultivated, and the manure that came up to fertilize those brought with it the seeds of alien grasses which have now taken over parts of the Hawthorne Plains grassland. These grasses are really nutritious, and as the work of Professor Padmalal showed some decades ago, the samba thrive on them, and as a result of that, probably we see this large expanding samba population on Hawthorne Plains. Tourists love it, people love to see these animals on the plains. But now slowly, these native tussock grasses are invading the invaders and becoming re-established on the plains. So a few years ago, when I think it was Minister Gamini Jayawickrama Pereira, who was Minister of Wildlife, he had ordered that these tussock grasses be removed and replaced with the alien grasses because that was better for a bigger population of samba. That is my former warden Pradeep, at Hawking Plains explaining this problem to me. Is that ethically correct? After all, in the FFPO itself, we say that people shouldn't use food to lure wildlife. But we're doing this in a national park. But at the same time, people like to see sambar. How do we draw a moral boundary between those two imperatives? Many people see farming as harmful to animals, that the conditions in which cattle are kept in farms in close proximity to each other, fed from the ground, without being able to graze freely, as being against the rights of animals. But yet, at Petiyagoda, we have an elephant farm and everybody seems to like that. What is the moral difference between a cattle farm and an elephant farm? These are tricky questions to address. I was talking yesterday with Dr. Himesh Singha, and he told me about a tree that is behind the herbarium in Petiyagoda in the gardens, the last remaining tree in Sri Lanka of its species, Ficus Trion. The wild population in Sri Lanka is now extirpated. These are prominent trees and they're gone. But yet, we do nothing to propagate that species. Ficuses have a complicated pollination cycle. The flower is in fact the fruit in an inverted form, and it needs a specialized wasp. Every single species of ficus has a specialized species of wasp that bores into the fruit and pollinates it from the inside. No one has studied the pollination of Ficus Trion. We have no idea how to keep this species alive from the last tree that is remaining in Sri Lanka. These are other photos from Dr. Jayasinghe which illustrate species of plants in Sri Lanka that are known from only a single location, only a single population. But we do nothing about preserving them, about learning to propagate them, about maintaining ex situ populations of these plants. Not difficult to do, but it's illegal. And somebody has to do it. In other countries, vast amounts of money are being spent to bring back extinct species. Last year, I quoted some controversy by proposing that we look at reintroducing a captive population of gaur to Sri Lanka. The gaur became extinct in Sri Lanka about 400 years ago. But we know it was widespread in the central province because of so many place names, Gaura area, Gaura Pitiya, Gaura Tanna, and so on, that are named after the gaur. But when I proposed this, I asked Mr. Milind Moragoda, our High Commissioner in Delhi, who had very good relations with the Indian government, whether he could raise it with the Indian government and see in principle whether they would agree, and if so, we would make a request through the National Zoological Gardens for this. The Indian government was very receptive to the idea of a bilateral cooperation on this. But what happened? There were countless people who went on social media to attack the idea. I remember Mr. Ranjan Marasinghe calling me up on that day and saying, "What have you gone and done? Everybody is scolding me." I don't follow social media, so I was not aware of it. But the point I'm trying to make is that even when you try to do something that is apparently beneficial, bringing an extinct species back to Sri Lanka, people get upset. It's very easy to upset people because our ethics can be very different. I see things one way, other people see things the other way, and we often don't discuss these problems and try and find solutions. But it was shocking to me that people could see that there is some moral wrong in restoring to life extinct plants and animals. That surprised me. But there is a formidable body of people in Sri Lanka who believe that, and we need to understand that. 20 years ago, when the Upper Kotmale hydropower project was proposed, there were massive environmental outcries. People closed roads in Thalawakale, had protests, they burned tires, there were protests in Colombo. Environmentalists were outraged about this project, which delivers 150 megawatts of power to the grid, massive amount of power to the grid. of cheap electricity. The project has now paid for itself twice over. Eventually, Mahinda Rajapaksa, when he became president, because he was a very authoritarian person, he overrode all the environmentalist objections and approved the project. The environmentalists were saying that there will be landslides, there will be earthquakes in Sri Lanka as a result of this tiny project. The project area is just 50 acres. But yet, 20 years later, we see no environmental harm. In fact, we see a lot of social good, new housing, new development that is taking place around this area. Now, we are seeing in Sri Lanka's most important migratory bird corridor, wind farms being erected on the island of Mannar. Yet, where are the environmental voices? In 2016, when this project was first being proposed, I pleaded with the ADB at least not to put power cables up across Wankalei Sanctuary, a Ramsar site, an important bird area, because of its importance to birds and to tourism. Once you put electricity cables, no one wants to take photographs or visit the place anymore. I wasn't supported by any of those environmentalists who fought so hard against the tiny Upper Kotpalli project, which had virtually no environmental impact. And now, as Professor Sampath Seneviratne is showing, these cables are causing substantial destruction of wildlife in Mannar. Why is it that people oppose hydropower but not wind power? What is the ethical or moral distinction they make between these two things? Another issue, as Mr. Marasinghe mentioned in his speech, is encroachment. All over Sri Lanka we see encroachment. In Norelia, the forests look like they've got a cancer growing through them. This is steadily decimating, especially our highland forests, the wet zone forests. In 1988, 35 years ago, Environmental Foundation Limited, one of Sri Lanka's best NGOs, went to court to force DWC to evict the squatters in Haggala SNR. That case is still in court after 35 years. Now that brings up another moral problem. Is it right after 35 years to evict settlers who are making a living? Maybe the original people who encroached are dead. Is it right to evict them and make them lose their livelihoods? On the other hand, if we don't evict them, it looks like we're encouraging some more encroachment. Where do we draw the moral boundary here? Human-elephant conflict, another very complex area. Last year we saw almost 150 people killed by elephants and almost 450 elephants being killed by people. What is the scale of the HEC? Of course, the scale of the loss of elephants is colossal. In 2011, DWC conducted a census of elephants in Sri Lanka and counted about 5,800 animals. But if you tot up elephant deaths annually since 2011 until today, it exceeds 6,000. So pretty much all the elephants that were counted in 2011 are now dead as a population. Elephants, of course, reproduce. A female elephant will have a baby every 2.5 or 3 years. And they go on to have babies for about 30 years. Is the rate of reproduction sufficient to maintain a viable population? We don't know. We need to do the research. But the fact remains that controlling the conflict with farmers is hugely complicated. We've built electric fences, 4,500 kilometers of electric fences. If you line up the electric fences that we have put up in Sri Lanka, it's enough to go around Sri Lanka's coastline 3.5 times. But still, the conflict continues. How serious is the problem for farmers? Being killed by an elephant, even one person being killed by anything, is a tragedy. Of course it is. We had 150 people being killed last year by elephants. But we had 300 people being killed by snakes. They're both accidental wildlife-induced deaths, but somehow we consider the elephant death to be worse than a snake bite. Why is that? Twice as many people. 17 times as many people were killed in traffic accidents last year than by elephants. Where is the awareness? Where is the shouting and yelling about road safety? We rarely see that. Why is it that human deaths from the human-elephant conflict are not just treated as accidental deaths? They amount to less than 4% of the accidental deaths in Sri Lanka every year. But we blow them out of proportion because they make good television. I'm not saying these things because I believe them. I'm just saying these things because I want you to think about them. Let's look at another area. The names of species. Many species are named after people, all these garden plants, for example. Even in Sri Lanka, many of our species that are common, the endemic genus Stromacaria, Camellia, the species that tea comes from, Salmonella, the diarrheal disease that we quite often get, Osbeckia, and even a genus named after me, Rohanella, are named after people. This is quite common in the Western culture. If you think about it, many of the SI units, the ampere, the volt, the joule, the newton, the watt, are named after individuals. Diseases like Alzheimer's, the Bunsen burner, Mount Everest, Horton Plains, and last year, even Gora Go Gamma, named after people. But then, some species get named after people we don't like. There is the beetle called Anophthalmus hitleri, and surely having a beetle by that name is offensive to Jewish people, if not to just civilized people as a whole, given what a monstrous person Adolf Hitler was. Should we fight to prohibit such names? You might not think so until I bring the problem one step closer to you. What if I were to tell you that James Watt, after whom we have the watt, the megawatt, the kilowatt, the gigawatt, was the owner of slaves? Even then it might not be close enough. You think slaves were African people, not really our problem. Let's come closer to home still. We have many species, more than 40 species of plants in Sri Lanka with the species name Walkeri. These species are named for a woman, a British woman, who was the wife of an army officer who served in Sri Lanka in the 1820s and 30s, called Anna Maria Walker. She was the first white woman to ascend Sri Pada in 1820. And she collected plants everywhere and she sent them to botanists in Europe, many of whom named these species after her. And that's how we have all these Walkeri species. Doesn't sound so bad until a few years ago someone found her diaries from her ascent of Adams Peak. I'm going to be publishing this shortly. And there in one place she says this. This is what she writes. Someone said that coolies are small horses. In other words, Sri Lankan laborers are like horses. He would have been near the mark if he had called them black cattle. She's referring to people like you and me as black cattle. But my coolies have rested long enough and I must proceed on my journey. This is going up Adams Peak. I don't think there's anyone in this room who is not offended by that statement. Should we call for the replacement of all the Walkeri names to change them to honor somebody who is less offensive to Sri Lankans? Maybe. Calls like this are going out all over the world by people who are offended by names. But then there's another problem. Many of the species that are affected straddle multiple countries. What would happen if we told the Indians, all right, half of the Walkeri names you can change, the other half we will change because these plants are shared by India and Sri Lanka. And they chose to name one of the species, they remove Walkeri and they name it Prabhakaran instead. Are we going to like that? These are difficult moral and ethical problems. There is another species of frog, Silphilatus saracinorum, named for these two people. These two Swiss scientists, Fritz and Paul Saracen, worked in Sri Lanka in the 1880s to the early 1900s. And one of the projects they did was to look at the ontogeny of elephants. The ontogeny was a big deal at the time because before molecular phylogeny was invented, so that we can look at the relationships of animals using just DNA, there were very few methods to find out how distant groups of animals were related. And there was a scientist called Ernst Haeckel who actually came to Sri Lanka. He lived here for a year in the 1880s. Haeckel had the idea that if you look at the early stages of the fetuses, and the fetuses resemble each other, that could show whether those groups are closely related or not. The idea that ontogeny replicates phylogeny. And so the Saracens decided to investigate this for elephants. How would you investigate this? You got to get elephant fetuses and look at them as they develop through various stages of the 2.5 years of gestation that an elephant fetus undergoes. How do you do that? You shoot lots of elephants. So they went around shooting elephants, female elephants, until they discovered that most of the elephants they were shooting were male. Then they found out how to see the difference, and they started focusing only on female elephants, but there's no way of saying whether the elephant is pregnant or not, especially because they wanted early stage fetuses. So after they'd killed a few dozen elephants and dissected them looking for fetuses, they found the work so disgusting that they eventually gave up. That is Fritz Saracen sitting on top of the elephant with the elephant's tail cut off and held in his hands. I'm sure many of you are disgusted by images like this. But it gets worse. They also went to Nilgala and they excavated Vadda graves to get skulls, which they wanted to compare with the skulls of European people to see whether the Vaddas were more primitive or not. Again, I'm sure that disgusts you. And so, should we change the name of the frog that's named after them? Many people, I suspect, in this room would say, yes, we should. But as I told you, it's more complicated. We have to think of these things in international terms. And finally, the question of illegal specimen exports. I dealt with this the last time I addressed you a few years ago. And my colleague, Tharindra Ranasinghe, has helped me to compile a list of papers published since the FFPO amendment of 2009, which gives us the present law. Since from 2010 onwards, there have been 70 scientific papers published in the international literature that reference 6,575 species. Tharindra has compiled an Excel spreadsheet with all the data of specimens illegally taken away from Sri Lanka and described. These have been described in some of the best journals in the world. Which countries did these scientists come from? Some of the best countries in the world. In some occasions, they lie on the publication and they say the specimens have been deposited in the National Museum of Colombo in Sri Lanka in Colombo. Not true. None of them has deposited a specimen in Colombo. One of them said he had deposited it in the German museum, in the Senckenberg Museum. I wrote to the museum and asked, they said they haven't received it. Other museums refused to reply. Still others say there is nothing illegal because Sri Lanka has not signed the Nagoya Protocol, so they have no responsibility once the specimen leaves Sri Lanka. The biggest offenders are Russians and Chinese, and I think Russians and Chinese have both been apprehended by DWC and prosecuted for illegally harvesting specimens from Sri Lanka. On the other hand, those people who illegally exported specimens published good scientific papers which are useful to us. They tell us about our biodiversity, they help us to manage our ecosystems, they help us to identify species that need protection, and so on. But they are founded in something wrong. What is the moral boundary? Do we use that science or do we reject it? Do we complain to the editors of those journals and say, please retract those papers, teach these people a lesson? That is the only lesson we can teach them now. Or do we not? Well, if you want to write to the editors, DG, I'm happy to draft the letters. We can insist, and I think we will succeed. If you write to all those journals and say, we want those papers retracted because the specimens were illegally collected and exported from Sri Lanka. It will set an example to the whole world if we do that this piracy must stop. I'm particularly upset by this because when this kind of thing goes on, it means that the DWC starts tightening its regulations, and that affects you, local researchers who want to work. It's more difficult for you to get a permit because they are justifiably concerned about foreigners doing illegal things in Sri Lanka. So the broad message I'm trying to say is that there is a multiplicity of ethical and moral problems when it comes to formulating policy. There is no one answer that fits everybody, and none of us as an individual is likely to be right. We are all to some degree mistaken. We must conceive it possible that we are always mistaken when we make policy, that other people might have different views, and we need to listen to them and to understand. And unless we see that there are two sides to every question, we are unlikely to do that. Thank you very much.